Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today I'll be showing you how to fix a failed 3D print during the build of this Phase 2 Commander Bly helmet. Alright, for starters, this helmet is a paid file from the Galactic Armory. You can buy it as well as many other designs from their website, which I'll link below. I'll also link all the other materials I used for this build. I initially thought that this build was going to be fairly straightforward, but unfortunately after printing all of the accessory pieces, I began to experience some of the worst print failures I'd ever dealt with. I was experiencing massive amounts of Y-axis shifting in the layers, and despite my best efforts to troubleshoot every possible problem, nothing seemed to work. But knowing I needed to get a video out this week, I decided to turn it into a bit of a learning experience for myself. Looking back on this footage, I should not have cut where I did. Instead, I should have cut a hair above the horizontal line that runs right above the T-visor. This would have made my life a lot easier, since trying to match the shape of the dome proved to be very difficult. Anyway, after scribing a very careful line around the helmet, I began cutting with my saw. And fortunately, after cutting about halfway through the helmet, the rest of the offcut just pulled away at that layer line. And from there, I took some rough grit sandpaper and sanded along all the edges, just to make sure there was no high points. From there, I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy and squirted it around the perimeter of the helmet, leaving a few gaps at the front, back, and sides where I could squirt some super glue. The super glue comes in handy because it sets up fairly quickly and allows the two pieces to stay stuck together as the epoxy cures. I squirted a little extra super glue into all the larger cracks just for good measure, and then let the helmet sit until the glue had dried. An hour or so later, I broke out my plastic welder just to add even more support to the seam. This thing works by heating up these tiny little squiggly pieces of metal, which then melt into the surface of your part. And then once the plastic around these pieces cools, you're left with a solid connection between both pieces of PLA. As you can see, this thing gets pretty hot and it's fairly easy to melt right through the helmet, so a gentle hand is required. Once I had finished with the helmet repair, I began prepping all my other pieces for primer. For some reason, the bottom of the binoculars printed pretty rough, and so I used a combination of my large chisel and heavy grit sandpaper to get rid of all the noodly bits. You'll see me using this chisel a lot in my projects. If you're gentle and apply even pressure across your parts, it makes removing resin supports and flattening any surface very easy. The rest of the prep was pretty standard. Just flattening pieces and making sure that everything laid nicely against the surface of the helmet. Or in the instance of these little earpieces, making sure that the axle was sanded down so that it fit nicely into the holes that held the binoculars in place on the side of the helmet. From there, I moved on to wood filler. I like to apply a heavy first coat and then go back with this little silicone scraping tool to get all the excess off. This will save you a lot of time in the sanding stage. And boy, let me tell you, there will be a lot of sanding. And then just when you think you're done with sanding, you'll have a bit more to do. Just plan to be sanding a lot. Even though this stage is fairly tedious, don't neglect this step. I guarantee you that the amount of time you spend sanding will pay off in the long run. You can see on the helmet that I put a pretty thick coat of wood filler on the dome. This was because I knew I'd be doing a lot of sanding back on this spot, and that in order to match the two pieces perfectly, I'd need a little extra material to work with. Again, looking back at this footage, it would have really made my life easier if I had cut the dome right at the little horizontal eyebrow line, but again, this was my first time dealing with something like this, so I just made the best of it. I actually ended up going through this process a few times just to really get the transition over that seam as clean as possible. And once I had that wood filler sanded down, I hit everything with a sandable filler primer. The resin printed parts didn't need much cleanup before paint, but before painting the binoculars, I needed to make sure that all the pieces fit together. That meant spending a bit of time scraping some of the primer and filler off of the parts. I also shaved off a bit of paint on the resin printed parts so that they would fit together nicely before assembly. Alright, I'll briefly touch on dry brushing. I wanted a few of the parts on the helmet to look like they were black coated metal, and so to accomplish this I first painted everything with a semi-gloss black and then went over it with a Vallejo metal color. I believe I used duraluminum for the respirator mesh and gunmetal gray or exhaust manifold for the other black pieces. It's really easy to overdo dry brushing, and so the key is to take your time, slowly building up layers of very light brushing on all the edges and high points. I've been really trying to restrain the amount of weathering that I do on parts. Not that a lot of weathering on a build is a bad thing, but I feel like if I want to grow as a prop maker, I need to be able to do a variation of weathering styles and not just rely so heavily on a heavy weather to hide my imperfections. Alright, so here's where everything kind of begins to fall apart, or at least at the time I felt that way. I had been sanding for so many hours that I just didn't even bother to do a final wet sand, and so the helmet's texture after this first coat of white paint was a bit rough. Here you can see I overmasked on these earpieces. This wasn't a big deal since I knew I could hide it during weathering, but like I said, I was trying to be a bit more refined with this project and was getting discouraged as I realized that my skill level was not up to task. So after I had come to terms with the fact that my white paint job was not as clean as I would have liked it, I moved on to masking for the yellow details. This tape is nice because it's super flexible, and if you don't pull on it too hard, you can really get it to mask some very complicated shapes. From there, I moved on to painting the chipping medium. This was my first time using Vallejo's chipping medium, and so I didn't totally know what to expect. I had watched a ton of YouTube videos on it, and it seemed fairly uncomplicated, but I had a lot of problems spraying it through my airbrush. Most of the people in the videos that I watched seemed to be spraying this on without thinning it, but it was so thick that I had a really tough time getting it to lay down nicely. And ultimately, I ended up thinning it with some of Vallejo's airbrush thinner. It also didn't help that the medium is perfectly clear, and so it was almost impossible to see on the white paint. After it had dried for about 30 minutes, I moved on to the yellow paint. I used Vallejo's yellow ochre. This was only my second time painting with an airbrush, my first time being the BD1 project I did a few weeks back, so needless to say I dealt with quite a bit of clogging and other issues. I don't know if my needle has too fine of a tip or something, but I found that I only got good results when I really thinned the paint down. Most people say you want your paint to be the consistency of milk, but it seemed to me that I needed my paint to be a bit thinner. This wasn't really a problem, but I did end up doing multiple coats to get the color consistent. After cleaning up a few spots where the paint bled through the tape, I moved on to the chipping. The chipping medium is activated with water, and then from there you can scratch it or scuff it however you want. I'm not sure if maybe I put on too thick a coat of the medium, but it seemed to be way more sensitive than I liked. And there were spots that I barely even touched, and a ton of paint came off. I have sort of mixed feelings about this step. It makes chipping the paint super easy, but it's almost too easy. Again, I don't know if I laid down too thick a coat of this medium, but there were many times where I felt very out of control on how much paint was being removed. After accidentally removing a giant glob of paint right on the front of the helmet, I knew the only way to hide my mistake would be to lean into heavy weathering. I was initially kind of upset about this, but I knew that for the sake of time, I needed to just soldier on and make it work later down the road. After letting the yellow paint dry again for about 30 minutes, I began masking up the brown stripe up the front of the helmet. The width of this line seems to vary in all the reference photos I was looking at, so I just kind of guesstimated that it was about a ½ inch on either side of the fin and maybe 0.4 inches down at the bottom of the T-visor. The curves on the helmet kind of complicate things, and so using my little marks as a guide, I sort of eyeballed it, just being really careful to make sure that from a straight-on view, the line looked straight. For the color, I mixed up Vallejo's burnt umber and mahogany brown. After letting the paint dry for about 30 minutes, I activated it with the chipping medium, did my chipping, let that dry for about 30 minutes to an hour, and then covered the whole thing with a matte clear coat. And for some odd reason, I got a ton of orange peeling after this step. But after letting the clear coat dry for a few hours, I knocked down all those high points, knowing that anything that was still visible could be hid with scratches and scuffs later on in the weathering. The following day, I masked up and painted the black stripe around the perimeter of the helmet. I could feel that I was in the home stretch and that I was also running out of time in order to get a video posted this week, and so I quickly threw on some gray paint to finish up all the major details. I also painted the little cheek stripes blue, and I was definitely rushing at this point, and so my paint job is very ugly, but like I keep saying, I knew I could fix it in weathering. After all this, I realized I hadn't even touched the binoculars yet, and so as quickly as I could, I masked it for paint. In order to get a nice clean line for the brown stripe on the binoculars, I laid down a piece of tape where the stripe would be, and then using some more tape, butted right up against that, and then removed that center piece of tape. From there, I repeated all the same steps as the helmet. Laying down chipping medium first, letting that dry for about 30 minutes. Laying down some paint, letting that dry for 30 minutes. Chipping, dry, and then clear coat. This clear coating is important because it protects your chipping detail from the acrylic washes later on down the line. I had some window screen laying around, which I plan to use for the Frown of the helmet. I didn't exactly know how I wanted to mount it inside the helmet, and so I did a few experiments. I knew that I didn't want to do a single layer of this screen, since it would be easy to see through, and so I eventually settled onto folding it into 4 layers and securing it with HVAC tape. After gluing all the accessory pieces to the helmet, I started weathering. I say this in every video, but don't be afraid to use the cheapest acrylic paint you can find. I use Apple Barrel acrylic paints since they're like 50 cents a bottle and I don't have to worry about mixing too much and wasting it. For my first wash, I like to mix up a very blackish brown, something that's close to the color of old motor oil, and then I water it down a lot so that the effect is not too heavy. From there, it's just making sure that it gets into every recess and then dabbing it away from the high points. After that first coat has dried for about 30 minutes, I move on to what has become my favorite step in the weathering process. For this step, I lay down some matte Mod Podge that has been watered down with IPA, and then sprinkle pastel chalks into all the recesses. The color of chalk that I use varies depending on the project, but for this helmet I used a mixture of dark brown, black, and this gross brownish green color. This chalk is super versatile, and it's totally up to you how heavy you weather with it. I tend to make it thick and chunky in the recesses of a prop, and then a bit lighter and dustier on the higher points. No matter what I do, I'm always trying to make sure that the gunk buildup looks natural, and that the dirt and grime has a reason to be where it is. Finally, here's a couple shots of me cutting out the acrylic sheet and the window film that I'll use for the T-visor, but because I was rushing to get this done, I didn't shoot the rest of it. But once the T-visor and the mesh had been installed, the helmet was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. For whatever reason, this project was definitely one of the more stressful builds that I've done, but I learned a lot, and I'm just glad that it's done and still looks great. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a video every Saturday. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to the over 600 people that have already subscribed. I'm really happy to see the growth of this channel, and I'm excited to see where I can take this in the future. So again, thanks for watching. It means a lot. Have a great day.